So coming up to the panel is Diana Lind, who will moderate, and we're joined by Jessie Grogan from the Lincoln Institute, Jenny Schuetz from Brookings, Patrick Condon from the University of British Columbia, and David Garcia from the Terner Center at the University of California, Berkeley. All of their bios, their full bios, can be accessed, like everybody, by the QR code on the back of the agenda. And that's also where you'll find all kinds of resources. So let me turn this over to Diana so that we can look at statewide measures for zoning reform and these issues of supply and demand and more construction.
Great, thank you, Anthony. So we've already been sort of touching on this issue of statewide zoning reform, but it's become an increasingly popular tool to address an array of housing challenges. Jessie and Jenny and I were talking about, it seems like there's about a dozen states that are seriously pursuing statewide changes to aspects of zoning, such as single-family zoning, parking minimums, minimum lot sizes, and transit-oriented development, among other aspects of zoning. The hope is that these changes will boost housing construction and residential density and address the housing affordability crisis. So while state-level reforms have a number of advantages, not least of which is that they're not so close to those local, intensely local fights between developers and NIMBYs. As we'll hear from California and Vancouver, these reforms may not be perfect, sufficient, or immune from local backlash. So I'm excited to moderate this discussion and get your questions ready for the Q&A. We all are really excited for that portion of the discussion. So let's begin with Jessie. Can you give us an overview of these statewide zoning reform initiatives and what they entail? What does the push for statewide reform tell us about the failures of local housing policy?
Thank you, Diana. And it's a delight to be in this panel with such an illustrious group of people. I'm actually going to answer your questions in reverse order and talk first about what's gone wrong at the local level. And this will not be new to many of you, but it seems like an important moment to sort of do some level setting about how we diagnose the problem and before we move on to the solution. So fundamentally what we have is a problem of geographical mismatch. The housing market, in many cases, it's a regional problem, if not in places like California, even at a higher geographic scale. But most of the tools that we're given to address that problem are at a local level. So we've created this system of perverse incentives, particularly for the more affluent, higher opportunity places, where current residents, even if they acknowledge the need for more affordable housing and more housing supply more broadly at a regional level, it's really in their best interest to keep the gates up and keep the housing supply low in their places. If housing supply is low, property values remain high, their places can provide a higher level of services with a lower property tax rate. It's great for them, it's terrible for the region. And so this challenge is really, it's not a question of how do we produce more housing units in these places, it's how do we get the political will. It's a politics problem, not a policy problem. And it's not a problem that seems to be particularly easily overcome. Advocates have been working for decades on trying to convince high opportunity places to build more housing with very little success. So this is where the state level comes in. We start to think about how we can change the level of the intervention to match the level of the problem. And I do want to note that, as in many ways, California is sort of an entity of its own. It gets its own expert on this panel. And so other than acknowledging that California was both ahead of the curve as far as having an affordability crisis and ahead of the curve as far as using state policy, I'm going to leave that to David and mostly focus on the rest of the country. So as Diana mentioned, this is such a moving target right now that it's hard for me to even give you an exact number for how many states have made state-level housing policies. It depends a little bit on how you define what a housing policy is, and it varies minute to minute. And I would suggest you get Jenny on speed dial because she knows but she's the only one who knows at this moment what is happening in all the different states. But I can tell you there are a handful of states, notably Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia, depending on how you count it, that have, legislation passed and are in the implementation phase. There's a much larger handful that are somewhere in the legislative pipeline with these issues, and then many, many more that are, very seriously asking questions about what it would look like in their state to pass some kind of housing and zoning legislation. This is a conversation that basically didn't exist at the state level outside of a few outliers, but has, rapidly zoomed to the top of many state legislators' priorities, and, is fairly dominant in the conversation in a way that it hasn't been historically. So similar to California, Massachusetts and Oregon have been doing state-level housing policy for quite some time. Massachusetts 40B was already mentioned, has been in the books for quite some time, and was just supplemented by the MBTA Community Act. In general, the things that these state policies tend to do are one of three things. First, they try to boost overall housing supply. Second, they try to increase the amount of inexpensive and below market rate housing. And third, they try to build housing in strategic places like near transit. Some policies try to do all three, some only try to increase supply. It varies a lot. It's a very wide-ranging group of policies. And in general, they try to do this through four basic mechanisms. First, fairly common, is using financial carrots and sticks. You can have access to this pot of state money only if you change your zoning to allow more density by right, for example, or you lose access to this pot of money if you don't do that. Second, for states that require things like comprehensive plans, they can require local communities to build more capacity for housing production into those required plans. That doesn't work everywhere because not everywhere requires that. Third, they can preempt local governments from restricting certain rules. For example, requiring that all local governments allow the construction of ADUs. Preemption is another topic that is very dominant these days. And there are ways that it can be used for the forces of good in terms of housing production. And finally, things like Chapter 40B in Massachusetts can allow developers to override local zoning restrictions if certain criteria are met. And of course, as with all things, many state policies combine several of these mechanisms in very different ways. And because every state is different, every policy looks a little bit different. But now with that whirlwind introduction, I think Jenny will tell you a little bit more about what's happening.
Yeah, thank you so much. That helped to set the stage here. So Jenny, I understand that you met here at Lincoln Institute this spring with a number of state housing officials trying to figure out how to implement these different measures and mandates. Tell us a little bit about what everyone learned and also what's involved with measuring the success.
Yeah, and Jessie did not give you the most important piece of information, which is if you want to know all of the nitty-gritty about state housing policies and what's being tried and what's being implemented, Lincoln Institute published a very nice brief this fall. I'm sure you can access it via the QR code. But seriously, there's a lot more detail that we're not going to be able to go into today. So we brought together representatives from 6 different states in the spring to try to get a sense of not just sort of what is the policy, but how are these new policies being implemented. And just as Jessie said, there are different kinds of policies. There are also different strategies for getting this stuff done. So a sort of general framework is, the state of California passes a law saying ADUs have to be legal in all residential areas, or duplexes have to be legal. And then that's a state guideline that doesn't just automatically go into effect. For this to take effect, local governments have to go back and rewrite all of their individual zoning codes, building in the state mandates and requirements. Sometimes they're given quite a bit of flexibility in how to do this. California initially gave localities a lot of flexibility around ADUs, and then they did things like say, well, you can build an ADU, but only if it's occupied by somebody who's related to the owner of the main house, right? So kind of restricting the access to renters. So they can provide lots of flexibility, or they can make it very prescriptive and narrow. That's going to matter for how much pushback they get and what local governments have to go through to implement this. But if you think about the sort of, the state legislature and the governor passed some law here, they provide some guidelines for local governments. Which local governments have to abide by this, because it's not always universal. What is it they're supposed to do? Local governments have to go through their own political process, right? Amending zoning means you have to rewrite the law, and that generally has to get passed by your city council and approved by your mayor. And of course in Massachusetts, it has to get passed by your town meeting, which is all of the NIMBY homeowners who show up and say, yeah, actually, I don't care what the state says, we're just not gonna do this. So there are a bunch of places in the process where local governments may or may not implement the state guidelines, or may push back against it, may try to implement it on paper in ways that it's going to make it really hard to actually build stuff at the end of the day. And there's often a fairly substantial time lag between when the state passes the law and when most of the local governments have newly compliant rules on the books that developers can actually start putting in applications. So not unusual for it to take 3 to 5 years from the state law passing until you actually have local zoning that's compliant. The depressing thing for people who want to monitor sort of outcomes of these laws, we would like to think, oh, the state now legalized a bunch of new housing, you can build apartments near transit stations, how many apartments are getting built? And of course the answer is, well, so far none, because we don't actually have local zoning in place, right? So it's going to take a couple of years before we start seeing even sort of the early stages, like developers requesting permits for these apartments in the new zones around transit in Massachusetts. So we are in a bunch of different stages. I'm going to also punt the California stuff to David. California has passed, more than 100 laws in the past 5 years. So statewide laws with various kinds of mandates or incentives for local governments. Some of them are far enough along that we are beginning to see evidence on them, but a lot of them are still quite new. There's been a variation in how local governments respond, right? So we pay a lot of attention to the super NIMBY affluent places that basically tell the state, yeah, I'm not even going to pretend to comply with this, and I might in fact sue you and say that you don't have the authority to require me to do this. So there's some lawsuits back and forth in both directions. But there are also a bunch of places that said, you know what, we need to build some more housing, and this sounds reasonable, and you're in some sense giving cover to local elected officials, right? So a forward-looking mayor or city council can go to their voters and say, hey, the state is telling us we have to allow apartments, we have to allow duplexes. We know, in fact, that we have an affordability problem, that many of the kids who grew up here can't move back to the community because it's so expensive. So we're going to take this opportunity and lean into the idea and figure out on our terms what works for us to comply with the state mandate, but also to actually generate more housing that we know some of our current residents need and would approve. So there's sort of a whole range of places that are willing to comply, places that aren't. And one of the factors that came out in the spring is that there are 3,000 counties and 40,000 cities and towns across the US. That ranges from giant cities like Los Angeles and New York, but also a lot of places that are pretty small and that have maybe one person in the entire planning department. So, you have a one person, or even actually in Massachusetts, there are a bunch of part-time planners who work for 3 adjacent towns. So you tell your part-time planner, hey, guess what? You need to rewrite the local zoning code of your 3 towns that you serve in order to implement this sort of complicated new state law. And they're gonna be like, well, yeah, but I do everything else I'm planning to and, approve all of the building permits. So I don't really know how to do that. And the need to provide some technical assistance, guidance, extra resources for a lot of local governments who don't necessarily, they may be interested in complying, but they just don't have the resources and capacity, and they're gonna need help in order to get it done.
Great, thank you. This question of figuring out what is working so far is going to take us some time, it seems. Nonetheless, I'm sure we'll still have questions about it. I'm going to pass this on to Patrick for his slides. So Patrick, zoning reform is squarely aimed at increasing the supply of housing, but you assert that it doesn't actually result in lower prices and rents. Explain.
Yeah, that's the big problem, isn't it? First off, I don't know anybody in the room except Anthony's. I was here 25 years ago, talking about smart growth, which I did a lot of. So in terms of my own street cred, I probably catalyzed over 5,000 affordable dwelling units over the course of my gray-haired career, and most of it in the Vancouver area with the hopes that this would increase affordability over the years. And here's the problem. It didn't help. For example, the city of Vancouver has, since the 1970s, had legalized accessory dwelling units. And almost every bungalow in the city has a basement suite down below. That's just one example of what the city has done. It's famous for this image you can see on the screen. That's the picture of downtown in 1970, and here it is basically contemporaneously from about the same location. That's about 60,000 new dwelling units just in a very small downtown peninsula. That goes the other way. But it's not just in the downtown peninsula that we added. In addition to those ADUs we talked about, we've had all kinds of infill, including line houses, duplexing, conversion, so that I think the next slide shows you how much new density. That basically what that chart is showing you, that we have doubled the number of people per square kilometer in the city since 1970. There is no other center city that I've been able to find in North America that's come even remotely close to the addition of new supply. And lo and behold, unfortunately, if adding supply was going to reduce prices, Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. It now has the most expensive housing in North America as measured by the gap. The brown line is wages, inflation-adjusted wages, and the blue line is the number of years you would have to save for a down payment. Well, the other way of measuring it is the price of the average home in the city of Vancouver is 24 times the annual salary. There's a whole bunch of very scary information in that graph, but that's really all you really need to know, that it's profoundly unaffordable despite all of our best efforts, including my own and many other people who've been working in that city. The question is why? Why didn't that additional supply help? And the answer seems to be that land prices absorbed all that benefit of that new supply. When we added supply, what happened was, because the capacity of those parcels was increased in terms of the financial return on it, it's reflected in this tremendous rise in land value, not rise in building value, but rise in land value. That's the blue line. And that blue line represents the land value increase in a so-called single-family lot, although I must remind this audience that we don't have single-family anymore. The minimum density is 4 dwelling units per 3,000 square foot lot, which is already townhouse density. What those allowances, what those new authorizations have done has been coincidental with huge increases in land price. And up until 10 years ago, I was the guy who was saying, oh, well, all you gotta do is add density on top of that land and everything's gonna be okay because that will dilute the land price component. But unfortunately, here's another example that shows the same distorted ratio between building value and land value, even in a high density building. So there seems to be a one-to-one correlation between additional new density and outrageous increases in land prices. Now, the per square foot land, for every square foot of built space that you deliver in the city of Vancouver, and it's around $1,500 per square foot, to purchase of that, $600 to $700 comes in the form of what they call the cost per buildable square foot. In other words, you're not buying dirt, you're buying buildable authority. So if a parcel goes from one FSR of 1 to an FSR of 10, we're seeing a 1,000% increase in the cost of the land, and this is happening all over the place. This is an American example from the American Enterprise Institute showing just land price increases 500%, 270% to 500%. Terrifyingly, it's concentrated in the parts of the Los Angeles basin where affordable housing used to be. And I want to go back just to this one. I'll conclude with this. Who's doing it right? You happen to be in the epicenter of a place that's doing it right. The only place I've been able to find that has a reasonable approach to this land price issue is Cambridge, where they say, we'll double your density, but we're not going to double the density, and I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect. We're not going to double the density and hope that that would produce affordability. We will double the density in what's called the Affordable Housing Overlay zoning ordinance. Will allow doubling of density anywhere in the city above the base density in return for an assured affordability that will be perpetual and will be at 30% of regional average household incomes. And as far as I can see, Cambridge is the only one, I'll conclude with this comment, that is doing the right thing instead of the wrong thing. The wrong thing is just to increase allowable density and think that that's going to solve the problem. The right thing is to figure out ways to capture that new land value increase in the context of rebuilding these neighborhoods. That's it.
All right.
Applause.
Somewhere Henry George is a one.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to David to talk a bit more about California, which has the most experience in implementing statewide housing bills to increase density near transit and remove barriers to housing supply. So what are the metrics at hand that show these policies are in fact helping in terms of affordability?
Thank you for that. I promise I know about things outside of California, but I'm happy to play this role here today. So in California, we have this really smug saying that as California goes, so goes the nation. And it is unfortunately true in many respects for a lot of folks here in other states. You have experienced this because you have a lot of Californians who now live amongst you because of our affordability problems, so apologies for that. But also California has been at the forefront of passing laws. Whether or not they work, we'll get into that, but they have passed a lot of laws. And part of what we have done at the Terner Center is really to track the passage of these laws. We had a report issued earlier this year that looked at changes passed since 2016, and this should be updated now because the legislative session just ended last month. But now we have close to 200 laws that have passed in California that pertain to housing in one way or another. And so we've tried to catalog all of these changes and really start to ask the question, are they working? And how do we develop metrics for figuring out if they are working? And so I'm going to very quickly go through what some of these changes are. So for example, California has an existing structure of dictating what cities are supposed to be planning for and supposed to be building. I won't get into the wonky acronyms, but basically the state says, cities, you have this housing goal, plan to meet that housing goal over an 8-year planning period. For decades, this process was toothless, and cities could basically completely skirt their responsibilities by completing this paper exercise. Thanks to a slew of new legislation, this is no longer true to a certain extent. Cities have to plan for significant amounts of new housing, and they have fewer and fewer tools to get out of actually approving that housing. And so there have been several changes made to state law that have codified these changes, and we can talk a little bit more about the specifics there. And then there are state laws that basically tell cities what they have to allow, so preemption. of local zoning. So we've mentioned this a lot already, but accessory dwelling units are probably our most famous and easily trackable example of this. ADUs now make up almost 20% of new homes permitted in California, which seems like a good thing, but also is a little bit scary because it means the rest of the market is not working. And then we've done other things too, like make changes to the state density bonus law, which allows developers to build higher, more densely in exchange for affordability. So that has been recalibrated over the last few years to try and work better. We also have a bill called Senate Bill 35, which developers of affordable and mixed-use housing can leverage to get that can bypass local approval and our famous or infamous state environmental law, the California Environmental Quality Act. And so we've done a lot of this kind of stuff too. And lastly, this is not zoning specific, but I think it's important to note, is the state has allocated record amounts of money to support the construction and preservation of deed-restricted affordable housing and permanent supportive housing and emergency shelter. And so until this last year, the state had record surpluses, and the governor was very liberal in distributing a lot of these funds to support the continued creation of affordable housing. And so that's been a significant source of affordable housing funding in the state of California. But bottom line, the question is it working? So my very simple answer to that question is not yet, but maybe. So there are a couple ways that we'd like to think about this. I go first and foremost to the extent that these laws are supposed to facilitate the construction of more housing, the increase of supply, we're actually not seeing that happen, not at the levels that they need to keep up with existing demand per what the state estimates we need to be building. So what you see here is a chart of historic housing production in California. It goes all the way back to 1980, and you can see back then we used to build routinely 200,000 units per year, sometimes as high as 300,000 units per year. But more recently, you can see that even with all of these state level changes, California hovers at around 100,000 units per year. Last year we had 120,000 units, so that's an increase, that's good, but it's still lagging well behind the 180,000 units California needs to be building per year per what the state housing department says we need to be building. Couple that with the fact that California remains incredibly unaffordable. Daniel kind of already hit the nail on the head earlier with his presentation broadly, but this is I think incredibly true in California as well, that despite a lot of housing bills being passed, it remains an incredibly unaffordable place to live, and increasingly unaffordable in places that used to be relatively inexpensive. So places like the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, those places actually see the highest increases of rent year over year versus places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. I think that's it. This last slide is just some thoughts on what we can do to try and make this stuff work better. I think we really need more time to assess some of these changes. So for example, I mentioned the state requiring cities to build or to plan for and build certain numbers of new housing units every 8 years. Those laws just passed, and cities are just now wrapping their heads around how to meet those goals. And so it could be that in 8 years we can look back and say that those changes really help cities move the needle on creating more supply. We just don't know quite yet. Cleanup bills, every year we have new bills that purport to, quote, clean up the existing bills that were passed the previous session. And I have no idea when we actually will feel like the bills are themselves clean. But we keep doing it. And so there's probably a lot, in California we pass a lot of laws that get chipped away until the very end. And so there's always the opportunity to go back and strengthen some of those laws that were passed in somewhat watered down versions. And then the last thing is, we make a lot of these decisions either at the state and local level without really good evidence and data on what the impact will be. And so we at the Terner Center are working on developing tools that can dynamically assess if I'm going to reduce parking ratios or increase heights. What does that actually mean for the actual production of new housing looking forward, so that we can better calibrate some of those policies. So again, California has done a lot. I would argue to any other state looking to California that you should not take the approach that California has taken. You should maybe pass like a couple bills, not 200. So really, in the spirit of what California is trying to do, yes, but not in practice. That would be my recommendation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, great. We're going to open things up to Q&A here with the audience. Maybe I'll just start off with one quick question, kind of leading off of what David was just saying, but I'm curious to know if you're finding that states are learning from the mistakes of other, statewide reforms. I think that, sort of early on, some of the reform efforts had kind of poison pills in a lot of the reforms, like you mentioned, requiring that, allowing ADUs, but requiring that a relative live in it or whatever. So are you seeing that kind of new statewide zoning reforms are actually kind of getting smarter and better at the kinds of issues that they're putting out there?
Yes and no. One thing they're definitely learning is the strategies for how you build a coalition to get this through. And we held the workshop in part to pull together people in the state level agencies that do implementation so they can talk to each other about what are the challenges of implementation, how is this hard. Things like you need to provide technical assistance and guidance so that localities know how to implement this. That's a message that is getting across very quickly, and the new states are starting to build that in and think about how do they do this. They are paying attention to some of the sort of specifics of the policy changes. So Minneapolis was the first city that passed legislation legalizing duplexes and triplexes in all residential neighborhoods, but they didn't allow them in larger structures. So you could essentially build a triplex that was the size of a single family house, and it turns out that's not very attractive for developers. So other places have realized that if you're gonna allow multifamily structures, you also need to change things like maybe the lot size and the height limit and some of the dimensional requirements around it. So there is some learning, but again, states are passing different things. So Massachusetts MBTA communities is really the first state that has done a very broad transit-oriented development bill focused on legalizing not just small units, but apartment buildings within some radius of transit. I think that's the kind of bill that could work really well in places like New York State, in Connecticut, in New Jersey, possibly in Virginia. Places that have pretty robust transit networks could do something like that, but they haven't gotten there yet. Oregon has certainly been paying attention to California's regional housing needs assessment. Oregon now has a similar version where communities will be assigned a quantitative target of units they have to produce over some period of time. Implementation of that is really complicated. How do you come up with a target? How do you know it's the right number? How do you monitor how much they're actually producing? We don't even really have good data on new construction that states can use to hold localities accountable. So we're hoping that sort of as more states start to adopt similar policies, we'll see them learning from one another. But right now, there's just a lot of experimentation in kind of different directions.
If I may add one thing, I think the temporal element of how long these changes take to actually show impact is a real impediment to learning. If we were all to be good scholars, we would make one change in one place and then wait 20 years and see what had happened and then make another different change. But obviously we can't do that here. So a little bit, it's sort of like trying to figure out what are those early promising indicators that we can look at to say, we don't yet know what production is going to look like, but permits, they're starting to pull permits. That tells us a little bit about success. So I think among the many things that we're learning how to learn about this and how to sort of make changes and adapt in a much shorter time frame than the scale of housing production would prefer.
Great. Okay. We've got our first question here. Look, small little hand up there. All right. Well, Liam, go first.
Hi, I'm Liam Dillon. I write for the LA Times. Part of me just wants to ask Jenny debate Patrick. So perhaps that should be my question. But in case that's not going to work, I'll add something else. Sorry. So I've written a lot about what happened in California for many years. Has happened in California for many years. And in my experience writing with the legislature is, there are very complicated political dynamics, state and local, that does make it hard for some of these bills to get passed. However, these bills don't cost any money, which is good for the state to not to have to do. And then the state also can't affect things. They can't pass a law that says the price of lumber will be cheaper or interest rates will be lower. And so my question is, how much, is there a percentage or some sort of estimate you could put, how much of this issue is related to what state or even local governments can do as it relates to zoning reform and parking reform, and how much of this are just things that are outside of their control?
Yes. So I'm going to push back a little bit on these laws don't cost governments any money. California has an entire state level agency, Housing and Community Development Department, that oversees this and that enforces it, right? So they have to review all of the plans that come in for the regional housing needs assessment, figure out whether they're in compliance, go back. The Attorney General is now getting involved, and they have, HCD is what, like 500 people? So there's a non-trivial budget on the California budget line that's enforcement and oversight of local production. And there's a corollary for local governments, right? So rewriting your zoning to comply with 200 laws in 5 years, like that takes actual staff time. And this is something I want local governments and state governments to think about. There are in fact costs to things that look like they're free, including things like inclusionary zoning, right? You still have to have staff to enforce this, otherwise it doesn't get followed. There's a lot of stuff going on in housing markets and affordability that's outside of zoning, that's outside of housing supply, that's outside of the control of state and local governments. Dan showed us interest rates, right? So we got away with rising housing prices for 20 years without the monthly costs changing that much because interest rates kept going down. When interest rates go up, it's more expensive for people to buy homes, it's more expensive for developers to build homes, and that's not going to change until the macroeconomy gets fixed. Supply shortages during the pandemic definitely played an issue in construction costs. We haven't actually talked about the availability of construction workers, but that's another factor. During the Great Recession, we lost essentially an entire generation of people who didn't go into the construction trades because we weren't building anything. So all the people who should today be experienced plumbers and electricians and carpenters aren't there, and creating those jobs, particularly at the higher levels, is not something we can do quickly. I think there's a discussion of manufactured housing later today. That's one of the ways that we can sort of get around this shortage of construction workers in some kinds of development, right? But there are a whole bunch of these factors that are stacked on top of one another, in addition to sort of the regulatory constraints. And since we're making things complicated today, and David Luberoff gets to simplify them tomorrow, I'll point out that we've been talking about zoning, and particularly things like prohibitions on apartments and large minimum lot sizes. There are a whole other set of regulations that matter, right? Boston and Cambridge, everything is historic, right? So you have to go through historic preservation rules, additional levels of design review, discretionary processes, even outside of the regular zoning. California's Environmental Quality Act, which basically anybody can use to sue and block any development they don't like for any reason. So there are lots of ways that you can make it hard to build outside of the specific rules that we've been talking about. This is part of the issue in California. Even if you get rid of basic zoning requirements that are a problem, you're still going to have things like CEQA. You're still going to have other sort of the California Coastal Commission that doesn't want you to build homes close to the coast. So there are a lot of other layers that clever and organized NIMBYs can use to block stuff.
Great, thanks. So this is a question for Patrick. So is there anything that you think is specific to the city of Vancouver that would explain this result that you found? Or is it just a general rule as you see it, that more parcels equals higher land prices? And I guess just to channel what Liam was saying, if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, be curious.
I have reluctantly concluded that this is a fact of nature, that we have been able to ignore during the post-World War II period, but it's coming back with a vengeance, which is that, as Adam Smith and Henry George both said, and I get extra points, that's Henry George.
Bingo card, yeah.
Essentially, every value created by wage earners and entrepreneurs in a metropolitan area can get, and appears to be getting, absorbed in real estate. And real estate is now much more about land value than it is about building value. and the land value is all about location within its metroplex. So I'm obviously quite frustrated because we don't hear much in sessions like this, even the comments from this board about land price. But land price is now more significant, a component of the price of delivering new housing than anything else, particularly in Canada. It's disguised a little bit in the United States because you had that big crash in 2008, which dramatically dropped urban land prices, but it has recovered and now it's going back up with a vengeance. We notice it more in Vancouver because in 2008, real estate only flattened for a couple of years and then took off. So that's my answer. And unless you can come up with, adding density is a good thing. It's good for transit, it's good for greenhouse gas, diversity of house types is a really good thing. But if your only reason for getting rid of zoning is to make sure that, if your only reason to get rid of zoning restrictions is on the assumption that you're gonna get affordability as a result, I question that. I really question that.
So I'm going to throw out a couple of counterfactual thought experiments that I think would be helpful. So what's the counterfactual to Vancouver building as much housing as it has over the last 20 years? If Vancouver hadn't built any more housing, if they'd imposed a growth moratorium, would Vancouver be cheap today? If Vancouver had built twice as much housing as it did, would it be cheaper than it is today, right? And these are the kinds of things we can't empirically test. The other version of this is to think about where relaxing density gets you more housing and what's the direction of the relationship between land values and density. So for our friends from Detroit, or if we have anybody here from, say, Baltimore or St. Louis, if you legalized 20-story apartment buildings everywhere in Detroit, would they get built everywhere? No. Right, so like the direction, right, so the way economists model this is you're only gonna get high density development where land is already expensive and where rents are high enough to support new construction costs, right? So we could upzone most of the US and not get skyscrapers because the construction costs are too high, the land isn't expensive enough, the rents aren't high enough. In places like Vancouver, where there's an enormous premium to be there, right? Vancouver also has some unique features, right? It was attracting a lot of people who wanted to invest in Canadian real estate as a place to sort of put their cash, right? So it would be interesting to think about what are some places that are equivalent to Vancouver that didn't build as much, and what do their prices look like?
Well, I can only speak with any degree of authority about Vancouver. So it's in answer to the first part of your question. I think if they had not built any, prices would have been the same. I think building what they have, prices are obviously the same. I think if they had built twice as much, prices would be the same. So any initiative whose major intention is affordability on the premise that supply is definitely gonna produce that affordability is questionable.
Well, I'm gonna continue the pushback gently and lovingly. By
Lovingly, I like that.
We're all friends here. But I think Minneapolis has some exciting potential. And again, this is all very caveated by the fact that it's very, very, very early in their experiment of increasing density. But they are finding their rent prices are not increasing as steeply as other places in the country. They're not struggling with the same kinds of inflationary pressures as much as other places in the country. So I think there is some promise in the Minneapolis experiment. Although I will say they are very quick to credit actually removing the parking minimums and getting rid of parking as the primary factor that seems to be leading to cost softening. So that's, I think, another argument why no one should ever, ever, ever require parking.
I will just add one more thing here is that, and this has been said already, but it bears repeating, that housing markets are regional. They do not end at the city limit. And so we experience this a lot in California, particularly in the Bay Area. I hear a lot of people talk about how the city of Oakland has met and exceeded its goal for creating new market rate housing. And so as a result, there should be lower prices. But if you look regionally at the more exclusionary suburbs, they have done next to no building. And so when you look at the housing market as a region, you can say, yeah, the city of Oakland is maybe pulling their weight or doing more, but the surrounding region is not necessarily keeping pace with that either. And so thinking about this is a bit challenging because in many cases, a city that is most impacted by the housing affordability problem does not have jurisdiction over the localities around it and what they end up doing. And this is where the state plays an important role, and where I am slightly hopeful that the new laws passed in California are going to really force these places to pull their weight when it comes to the creation of new supply. But again, we don't know if that's going to happen yet.
Can I just ask a quick clarifying question about Vancouver, and then we should open up to another question here. But it's my understanding Vancouver's population hasn't really actually grown.
It's doubled in that same study period.
It's doubled.
It's doubled, yeah. And the number of dwelling units is tripled because that doubling is coincident with a reduction in family size. So there's been a tripling in housing units and a doubling in population.
Okay. All right. Good to know. All right. Yep. You got the mic.
The MBTA Communities Act, my understanding is that it doesn't impose housing production goals on these suburban jurisdictions. What it imposes on them is this requirement that they zone for greater capacity, and then the market will come in and do what it's going to do on that. And I wonder if that's smarter than what California's done or what Oregon is going to do. Like it doesn't require this like one economist in Oregon to come up with a number that he's going to give every community. It may sort of take into account like what Liam was mentioning earlier, like what happens when all of a sudden one year like interest rates spike or lumber costs spike. And so I just wonder, to come back to sort of the earlier idea of like whether or not states are learning from each other, like is that smarter or is it better in ways that I'm not appreciating, that you have to just go to communities and tell them your number is X?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways in which the sort of the goal of the MBTA communities is different from what California and Oregon are doing. One is that they're really targeting specific locations rather than sort of overall quantities. And it would be incredibly hard to do both of that, right? So what you really want to do is get more apartments built around transit, whether that's to increase ridership on the commuter rail or just that's where you think there's the most demand. Setting production targets within a half mile of the train station and then monitoring that, I think would be basically impossible to do. I mean, just like not feasible to do with the data. This is a particular place where we also know that there's a lot of really, really valuable land that's underused. So for those of you who don't know sort of the suburban commuter rail system, there are a lot of suburban commuter rails that'll get you to downtown Boston in 20 minutes and surrounded by a surface parking lot, which is probably not the highest and best use. And so this is sort of a way of strategically getting to places that have a lot of these layers of restrictions in places where we think there should be more housing, but allowing them also to keep their single family neighborhoods nearby. So some of this is a little bit of a political compromise as well as kind of the target policy. I will say that Oregon is running very quickly into the limits of data to set targets and then to monitor production, particularly in smaller communities. So their state law applies across all of the state, and small communities in rural areas, it's really hard to track production. And it's also going to be really, really hard to know if smaller rural communities don't build housing, don't meet their targets. Is it because they are intentionally obstructing growth, or because there isn't demand and developers don't want to build there? Or developers, aren't even in many of these communities, right? You don't have just a big home builder industry everywhere. This is going to be an issue when it comes to enforcement. How do you tell places we're going to, sick the attorney general on you or withhold funds if you can't prove that this is deliberately because of their own policy choices? We'll have to see how this works out. They haven't yet cracked the code either.
Great. We have 10 minutes and a few more questions. Thanks.
I'm Jim Gray from the Lincoln Institute. I'd like to modify the counterfactual there just by one point between Jenny and Patrick. So what if Vancouver had produced twice as many units, but half of the additional units had been price restricted to assure permanent affordability? How would that have changed your counterfactual?
Is that a question to me? Yeah, I think the strategy I ended with for Cambridge, if there was a requirement for affordability that was permanent, it would have affected land prices. The phrase I use is municipalities need to have the power and should discipline the land market. And a lot of the initiatives that we're talking about today do the opposite. They unleash the land market. So it's a fundamentally different philosophy of how to solve the problem. My own view, after my own experience and working on this topic, is that unleashing the land market through opening up, new authorities to do with your land whatever you want, or more than what you can presently do. Again, if your objective is affordability, and you think that the cornucopia of the free market is going to deliver housing at affordable prices now, is a misdiagnosis of the problem. My diagnosis is that the solution to it is much more efficacious if municipalities use their leverage power over zoning to not just zone for affordability, but to insist on it through some percentage. Cambridge uses 100%, which is quite aggressive. A lot of municipalities are doing 15 and 20% kind of thing, so that's part of the tradition. And by the way, challenges of California's inclusionary zonings laws have survived Supreme Court challenges both at the state level and at the national level. So this is a legitimate, constitutionally approved interference with highest and best use of land if you can give it a social benefit, health, safety, and welfare justification, which is what has been done. So my recommendation to this group is that it would be much more efficacious if municipalities were encouraged to insist on affordability or required to insist on affordability to discipline the land market, which is out of control. In Canada, it's out of control to a much higher degree, but the trend lines that were shown here, and you'll see it more and more for the affordability. I mean, very rarely do you see land prices, as I've tried to show, in concert with real estate prices. But when you do look at that, you find in most cases, contemporaneously, land prices the real driver. It's not construction cost from supply chain. That was a problem. It kind of went away. It's like responsible for 20%, but of increase in costs. But land prices are much more significant motivator. So discipline the land market.
So one thing I'll just quickly add is that in California, you will be hard pressed to find a legislator who will say like the zoning reform is going to stop unaffordability and it's going to create affordable units. And so a lot of legislators there have taken the approach that while they are exploring ways to increase housing supply writ large, they're being very intentional about using some of the levers on creating actual deed-restricted affordability, whether that's through an existing project, like the streamlining that's been passed in California, where you are only allowed to use it if you have affordable units, either 100% or 50% as part of your project, depending on really wonky calculation. But there have been a lot of concerted efforts, both at the state and the local level, to try and use land use policy to incent specifically affordable housing, and in many cases, the creation of mixed income housing as well. I think of the state density bonus program as well, which really was not working prior to a lot of these legislative changes that have now are creating deed-restricted affordable housing in new construction without government subsidy. And I think it's also important to remember that in California, we build about 20,000 units of traditionally federally subsidized affordable housing, and that's with all of the money that the state has poured in. That is with all of the land use incentives that the state has created, and 20,000 units per year is not enough. The state actually needs 80,000 units per year, and so the ability to recalibrate how the market works to create affordability along with the increase of general supply is, I think, really critical when we talk about actually creating the numbers that we need across the board.
And I'll just say quickly that we actually have a lot of evidence on inclusionary zoning programs. So, there are lots and lots of them across the country, mandatory, voluntary, with density bonuses, with offsets. And there's a sweet spot for the affordable requirement. So if you say, Cambridge has a substantial density bonus, but in most cases, if you require that 50% of the units are set aside for low-income households, you're effectively killing the project, right? Without some sort of a cost offset, it's just going to make the project infeasible. And I think somebody asked Dan, sort of about how this is used intentionally. There are, in fact, a bunch of exclusionary suburbs that have inclusionary requirements with affordability set so high that it actually kills the project, and that's quite intentional and deliberate. But offering something like a density bonus in places where developers can take advantage and the market supports that can be very helpful.
Just to comment on that, in Vancouver, we can get affordable housing if land is free with average wages. I've had the debates with the development community about all that will not make the project work. But what never comes up is that you've already assumed a $600 per buildable square foot cost for the land, and no one ever says that's the problem. That's out of hand. No, and the system is not set up in a way to discipline those land markets, to drive down that cost. Hard to drive down construction costs, but policy can really drive down land costs or at least stabilize it. It's very unstable at the moment.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we can follow up with more at lunch.
Given this is one of those about how we cover zoning and how we're able to kind of relay that information to readers. Given that zoning is, I've heard from people that they're trying to just demystify it and try to make it more accessible for people to understand. And given the history of zoning policies in this country that have excluded people purposefully, how can we best cover zoning to be able to inform readers, but also give them an example to be able to advocate for some of these reforms and advocate for themselves on a local or a state level?
So I think it depends on the audience. And I think about this in a few different ways. In California and in places like Oregon, the conversation around land use reform and zoning has really centered on equity because a lot of the land use restrictions we have in place today were put there for very nefarious reasons, right? They were there to intentionally exclude people from color and low-income people from exclusive communities. And so particularly in Oregon, a lot of the conversations around what they ended up doing there started with that question because that was what mattered to a lot of the residents there. If you go to a place like Montana, the question there is not equity, or at least for the majority of people there, the question is like more free market values. Like you should be able to do what you want with a piece of land that you own. And interestingly enough, in Montana, it is kind of an anti-sprawl message there too, because so much of what people care about there is their natural beauty. And so incentivizing infill development there through land use changes really resonated with the people there. And so we haven't talked about Montana at all, which in my mind has done the most impressive work when it comes to land use reform. California's been trying to do this for 6 years, and Montana did it in one session with a Republican supermajority, which was really interesting. So we didn't get into the political dynamics of all this stuff too, but it's actually quite fascinating, and maybe for another convening.
And I'm just going to make one quick request since I have a whole room full of journalists here. Please don't say ending single-family zoning and tell your editors not to put that in the headline, because that's not actually descriptive of what's going on. So the way zoning works is it lists out the kinds of structures you are allowed to build, and anything that isn't explicitly allowed is prohibited. So single-family exclusive zoning, the zoning says you may build a single-family detached house, period. Everything else is prohibited. To end single-family zoning really means you are adding in additional structures, and the zoning change has to be very clear about what is being added, right? So you can build single-family detached homes and you can build ADUs, or you can build single-family homes and you can build attached townhouses, right? So the end single-family zoning could cover everything from allowing ADUs to allowing skyscrapers or industrial facilities. So figure out what it is that the zoning change is actually doing. And I hear your question. This is a really complicated, technical, wonky topic, and people's eyes glaze over very quickly. It's hard to get them engaged with this. But it's also an area where we want to be as clear and accurate as possible to what these policy changes are really doing.
And I would just add, to repeat myself, that journalists could say, it's not the housing that's unaffordable, it's the land, it's the dirt under the house that's unaffordable.
Okay, please join me in thanking this great panel.